The spring air in London carried the soft scent of blooming wisteria as Alara Quinn stepped out of a black car in front of the Ashbourne Hotel. The building glowed under strings of golden lights, the city's hum muted by the plush carpets and quiet elegance inside. She adjusted the thin silk strap of her evening gown, a deep emerald that matched the color of her eyes, and took a steadying breath. Tonight was another charity gala for Damien's company, another night where she would play the perfect wife, smiling at strangers, listening to stories she didn't care about, and making Damien's world look as polished as the marble floors beneath her heels. Inside the ballroom, chandeliers spilled light over crystal glasses and polished silver. Waiters weaved between guests with trays of champagne, the delicate clink of glasses blending with the soft hum of a live jazz quartet. Damien stood near the center of the room, his tailored black suit cutting a sharp silhouette, his smile perfectly timed for every handshake. Alara moved to his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, the familiar rhythm of their public appearances already set in motion. He introduced her to board members, investors, and politicians, each shaking her hand and complimenting her grace. She thanked them all with practiced warmth, never letting her voice falter. Her own career, once full of potential, was now a quiet shadow of what it could have been. Years ago, she had been offered a curatorship in Paris, but she turned it down so Damien could focus on expanding his brand. She told herself it was the right choice, that their shared life was worth more than her personal ambitions. Most days, she believed it. Midway through the evening, Damien excused himself to greet someone across the room. When Alara turned to follow, she saw her husband leaning in to speak with a woman she had never met, a woman who seemed to draw the room's attention without even trying. Tall, with dark, glossy hair that fell over one shoulder, she wore a sleek black gown with an open back, her jewelry understated but impossibly expensive. Her lips curved into a confident smile as she spoke to Damien, her hand resting lightly on his forearm in a gesture far too familiar for a first introduction. When Damien finally brought her over, his voice carried a subtle energy, a little too warm. "Alara, this is Celine Vaughn, my business partner from New York. She's in town to help with the West End expansion." Celine extended her hand, her nails painted a deep crimson. "It's a pleasure, Alara. Damien has told me so much about you." There was something in her tone, soft, polite, but with an edge Alara couldn't quite name. She smiled, the kind of smile she used when she wanted to hide what she was thinking, and shook Celine's hand. The woman's grip was firm, her gaze steady. The three of them chatted briefly about art, travel, and the challenges of business, but Alara found herself listening less to the words and more to the way Damien's eyes lingered on Celine when she spoke. His attention didn't waver, not even when other guests came to greet him. It was as though, for that moment, the bustling ballroom faded away and Celine was the only person he saw. As the night drew on, Alara excused herself to fetch another drink, weaving through the crowd until she found a quiet corner by the tall windows overlooking the Thames. From there, she could see Damien and Celine again, Damien leaning in, Celine's lips parting in laughter, the glow of the chandelier catching the sharp line of her cheekbone. And then it happened. A look, just a fraction of a second, but enough to make Alara's stomach tighten. It wasn't the look of business partners. It wasn't even the look of friends. It was something unspoken, something that belonged behind closed doors. The champagne in her glass suddenly tasted flat. She turned toward the window, staring out at the slow-moving river. London's lights blurred against the night sky, but she couldn't stop seeing that glance over and over again. It was nothing concrete, just an expression, but in her gut, she knew it meant more than either of them would admit. And though the music played on and the crowd laughed and danced, the air around her felt colder. Alara took a long breath, pressing her lips together as she rejoined the party, wearing the same serene smile she always did. But inside, a small crack had formed in the perfect portrait of her life, and she couldn't help but wonder if it would only grow deeper. If you want, I can continue Chapter 2, Cracks in the Canvas, in the same immersive cinematic style, so the tension escalates naturally from here. The following weeks blurred into a routine that felt strangely hollow. Damien was home less and less, his absences explained away with a casual, "It's just business, Alara. These deals don't close themselves." He would leave before dawn, the scent of his cologne still hanging in the bedroom, and return long after midnight, slipping under the covers without a word. When she asked about his trips, his answers were vague. Meetings in Milan, negotiations in Paris, a client dinner in Madrid. Each explanation was believable, yet the way his eyes darted away from hers made them feel rehearsed. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Alara was working from home, cataloging a new collection for the gallery, when the intercom buzzed. A delivery man stood in the lobby holding a plain brown package. It was heavier than she expected, the corners slightly bent. There was no return address, no note, just her name written in thick black ink. She carried it into the kitchen, her heart inexplicably beating faster. When she slit the tape open, the air in the room seemed to change. Inside, she found a stack of glossy photographs. The first image showed Damien seated at a Paris cafe, his head tilted toward Celine as she leaned in close, her fingers brushing the edge of his sleeve. The next captured them walking along the Seine, their hands clasped together as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Another showed them at what looked like a private dinner, candlelight casting soft shadows over their faces, their expressions unguarded, intimate. Alara sat down heavily, her pulse rushing in her ears. The rain outside tapped against the window in steady rhythm, as if marking the seconds she stared at the images. She wanted to believe there was an explanation, that perhaps these were taken out of context. But the warmth in Damien's smile in those photos was different. It was the kind of look she hadn't seen directed at her in a long time. Her first instinct was to confront him. She even reached for her phone, thumb hovering over his number. But something stopped her. Maybe it was fear of hearing him lie to her face. Maybe it was the small, stubborn hope that she was wrong. She slid the photos back into the envelope, tucked it into the back of her desk drawer, and told herself she would decide what to do later. That evening, her phone rang. Margot's voice, warm and lilting even over the distance, filled the room. "You've been quiet lately, Alara. Is everything all right?" Alara forced a smile she knew her mother couldn't see. "I'm fine, Mum. Just busy with work." There was a pause, the kind that stretched with unspoken worry. "You don't sound fine. Is Damien treating you well?" The question hit too close. Alara swallowed hard, glancing toward the drawer where the envelope now lay hidden. "Yes, he's fine. Everything's fine." Margot sighed softly, as if she knew her daughter was holding something back. "You know you can tell me anything, love. The truth always comes out in the end." After they hung up, Alara sat in the dim kitchen, the city lights flickering through the rain-streaked glass. She tried to focus on the sound of the storm, but her mind kept drifting back to those photographs. The image of Damien's hand entwined with Celine's seemed burned into her vision. She told herself she wasn't ready to face it yet, but deep down, she knew the cracks in her carefully painted life were no longer small lines. They were widening, threatening to shatter everything she thought she knew. If you'd like, I can now continue directly with Chapter 3, The Shattered Frame, building on this tension and pushing Alara toward her first direct confrontation with Damien. The flight to New York had begun with polite conversation and Damien buried in work emails. Alara had tried to imagine the trip as a chance to reconnect, just the two of them in a new city, maybe even a spark of the romance they once had. But the closer they got to Manhattan, the more Damien seemed distracted, answering her questions with half sentences, his mind clearly elsewhere. On their first night, Damien insisted they attend an exclusive benefit at the Waldorf, hosted by one of his most important clients. Alara dressed carefully, choosing a navy silk gown and simple diamond earrings he had once given her on an anniversary. She hoped he would notice. The ballroom was grand, with towering arrangements of white orchids and a soft glow from crystal chandeliers. Waiters glided through the crowd with trays of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Alara stood beside Damien, smiling when introduced to strangers, trying to absorb details about people she would probably never meet again. But within minutes, Damien excused himself to handle a few introductions, disappearing into the crowd. At first, she waited by the bar, sipping champagne and watching the sea of elegant guests swirl around her. After half an hour, she began drifting through the room looking for him. That's when she saw them. Damien and Celine, standing close near a side entrance, their faces lit with that same quiet intensity she had noticed in London. Celine's hand rested lightly on his chest as she leaned in to say something. Damien laughed, a sound warm and unguarded, before glancing around. Without a word to anyone, they slipped out through the side door together. Alara felt the air leave her lungs. She stayed frozen for a moment, torn between chasing after them and keeping her dignity. In the end, she turned and left the ballroom through the main exit, the music and laughter fading behind her. When Damien returned to their hotel room hours later, he found her sitting on the edge of the bed, still in her gown. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice low but steady. He frowned, loosening his tie. "I told you I had business to discuss." "With Celine? Outside the party? For 2 hours?" His expression hardened. "You've been acting paranoid lately, always reading into things. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is to have my wife questioning me like this?" Her chest tightened. "I saw you leave with her, Damien. I'm not imagining it." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a condescending calm. "You're tired, Alara. This trip is supposed to be important for us, and you're turning it into a fight. Maybe if you focused on supporting me instead of inventing stories." "Inventing stories?" Her voice cracked, not from anger, but from the sting of disbelief. He shook his head as if she were a child misunderstanding something obvious. "I work hard to give you everything you have, and this is the thanks I get? You should be proud of me, not suspicious." The words lodged deep, twisting guilt and doubt through her. He kissed her forehead like a father soothing a stubborn child, then walked into the bathroom, shutting the door with finality. Alone in the dim hotel room, Alara stared at her reflection in the window, her hair still perfectly styled, her gown uncreased, her posture straight. On the outside, nothing seemed out of place, but inside she felt faded, as if years of putting him first had erased her from her own life. In the silence, she realized something sharp and undeniable. She had sacrificed her dreams, her career, her voice, and somewhere along the way, she had become invisible to the man she gave it all to. If you want, I can continue with Chapter 4, Blood in the Water, where the danger deepens, and Alara starts to see that Damien's betrayal is only part of a much darker truth. The morning after they returned from New York, the sky over London was the color of slate, rain streaking the penthouse windows. Alara sat at her favorite corner table in a small cafe near the gallery, sipping a cappuccino and trying to lose herself in the quiet hum of other people's conversations. She was still replaying Damien's words from the hotel room, the way he had turned her questions into accusations against her. She was halfway through her drink when a man in his late 30s approached her table. He was tall, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, and a face lined with the kind of weariness that came from chasing truths most people preferred to ignore. "Alara Quinn?" he asked, his Irish accent softened by years abroad. She nodded warily. "Yes. Do I know you?" He slipped a small press badge from his jacket pocket. "Liam O'Connell. I'm an investigative journalist. Yes, I'm working on a piece about Holt and Vaughn, and I think you might be able to help me." Her first instinct was to end the conversation. "I'm not interested. she said, glancing toward the door. I understand, he replied evenly. But before you decide, you should know, your husband's company is under investigation for illegal art trafficking. Stolen pieces, forged provenance papers, offshore accounts. I have reason to believe Damien knows more than he lets on. She felt a flare of anger. That's absurd. Damien's work is legitimate. But she stopped, because somewhere in the back of her mind, she remembered a night months ago when she had stumbled into his home office and seen an encrypted folder labeled private, alongside large, unexplained transfers to accounts in Monaco and Dubai. When she'd asked him about it, he dismissed it as tax structuring and told her not to worry. Liam studied her hesitation. You've seen something, haven't you? I think you should leave, she said, standing, her voice less certain than she wanted it to be. He handed her a card before walking away. If you change your mind, call me. The truth will surface, Alara, whether you're ready or not. That evening, Damien returned home unusually late. Alara was in the bedroom, folding laundry, when she noticed something odd. A streak of dark red on the cream-colored curtain near the balcony door. It was small, but stark against the pale fabric, the shape smudged as if wiped hastily. What happened here? She asked when Damien came in, loosening his tie. He glanced at the stain briefly before turning to hang up his jacket. Just a cut on my hand. Caught it on a sharp edge at the office. She looked at his hands. There was no bandage, no fresh wound, only faint marks near his knuckles. It looks like blood. That's because it is, he said with a quick, dismissive smile. Don't overthink it. Her instincts roared in protest. The way he avoided her gaze, the casual way he brushed it off, it didn't feel like the truth. That red smear seemed to pulse in her vision, a mark she couldn't unsee. She said nothing more, but as Damien stepped into the shower, she pulled out Liam O'Connell's card from her handbag and turned it over in her fingers. She wasn't ready to trust him, but she was beginning to understand that whatever cracks existed in her marriage, they might be hiding something far more dangerous than infidelity. If you want, I can continue with Chapter 5, Betrayal in Broad Daylight, where Alara's worst fears about Damien and Celine are confirmed in a way she can no longer ignore. The call came on a Thursday morning. Damien's voice was brisk, almost distracted, as he told Alara he needed to fly to Dublin for a quick business meeting with a client. He promised he'd be back by Saturday evening and suggested she use the time to relax. Alara simply nodded, though the unease that had been building over the past weeks made it impossible to feel calm. 2 days later, she received a message from an old friend in Dublin, a fellow curator named Fiona, asking if she was in the city. The question puzzled her until Fiona mentioned she'd just seen someone who looked very much like Damien outside a cafe near St. Stephen's Green. Curiosity, and something darker, pushed Alara to book a last-minute flight. She told herself it was just to clear her head, but deep down, she knew she was chasing the truth. Dublin's air was cool and damp when she arrived, the streets slick from a morning drizzle. She walked toward the cafe Fiona had mentioned, her heart thudding harder with each step. The crowd outside was thick with people enjoying a rare break in the clouds, the clink of coffee cups and low murmur of conversation filling the air. Then she saw them. Damien and Celine sat at a corner table on the patio, their chairs angled close. Celine's laugh floated across the space, light and easy, and Damien's hand rested on hers in a way that made Alara's stomach twist. As she stood frozen on the opposite pavement, Celine leaned in and kissed him. Slow, deliberate, unhurried, while passers-by walked past as if it were nothing. The world seemed to narrow to that one image, her husband in plain sight, touching and kissing another woman as if their life together meant nothing. Humiliation surged through her, hot and suffocating. She turned away quickly, not trusting herself to keep her composure in the open street. That night, Damien returned to their Dublin hotel late, smelling faintly of wine. Alara was waiting, seated in the armchair by the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I saw you today," she said quietly. His brows furrowed, but there was no flicker of guilt in his eyes, only irritation. "Saw me what?" "Kissing Celine, outside a cafe. Do you even care who sees you anymore?" For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then he laughed once, without humor. "You've really let your imagination run wild, Alara. I was meeting her for work." "Work?" Her voice rose despite her efforts to control it. "You were holding her hand. You were kissing her. Don't stand there and tell me I imagined that." Damien stepped closer, his expression sharpening. "You want the truth? You've become so obsessed with finding fault that you can't see what's right in front of you. You're nothing without me. Everything you have, everything you are, it's because of me. You'd be invisible if I walked away." The words cut deeper than any slap. Alara felt them like a blow to her chest, knocking the air from her lungs. She didn't speak, couldn't speak. As he walked past her to the bed and began scrolling through his phone, already dismissing her from his mind. She sat there long after he had fallen asleep, staring at the faint reflection of herself in the darkened window. The humiliation had burned away into something colder, heavier. His words had left a scar she could feel forming beneath her skin, a reminder that whatever love had once been between them was gone, replaced by a cruelty she could no longer ignore. If you want, I can now take this directly into Chapter 6, The Art of War, where Alara starts to quietly fight back by gathering evidence with Liam. Alara didn't confront Damien again after that night in Dublin. Instead, she learned to keep her face calm, her words measured, her tone agreeable. She stopped asking where he was going, stopped waiting up for him to come home. In his mind, perhaps she had finally surrendered, but in truth, she was already plotting her quiet rebellion. The first step was calling Liam O'Connell. They met in the back corner of a discreet cafe in Shoreditch, away from the circles Damien's company frequented. Liam arrived with a battered leather satchel and eyes that scanned the room before sitting down. "If you're sure about this, there's no turning back," he said, his voice low. "I'm sure," Alara replied. "If he's done what you think he has, I need to know. Not just for me, but because I've been complicit, even unknowingly." They began with what she could access: copies of invoices from the gallery, records of art shipments Damien had sponsored for private collections, and her memory of the strange transfers she had once seen in his office. Alara reached out to trusted contacts in the art world, curators and archivists who owed her small favors, asking careful questions about certain pieces that had passed through Damien's network. Within 2 weeks, a troubling pattern emerged. Several high-value paintings Damien's company had brokered were now missing from their supposed buyers' inventories. Provenance documents were riddled with inconsistencies, some using the same falsified signatures. One file Liam decrypted showed a shipment of 3 rare works listed as restoration returns, sent to a storage facility in Antwerp, but the facility had no record of receiving them. "It's not just smuggling," Liam said one night, leaning over his laptop at her kitchen table. "These are stolen masterpieces, passed through legitimate channels until they vanish into private hands. Your husband's signature is on half these deals." The deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. One evening, Alara returned to find a plain white envelope slid under her door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with no words, only a photograph of her taken from across the street as she unlocked her building. The next morning, Liam's apartment door had been scratched with a crude X. They kept going anyway, tightening their digital trail and meeting only in safe, crowded places. But the danger stopped being abstract the night the brick came. Alara had been working late at the gallery, the quiet space lit only by the warm glow of the desk lamp. At exactly 1:14 a.m., a sharp crash shattered the silence. Glass exploded inward as a heavy brick hurtled through the front window, scattering shards across the polished floor. Her heart pounded as she crouched behind the desk, waiting, listening for footsteps outside. There was nothing but the distant sound of a car engine fading into the night. When she finally crept forward, she saw a scrap of paper tied to the brick with twine. In block letters, it read, "Stop looking or you'll be next." Alara stared at the words, the adrenaline burning cold in her veins. The warning was clear, but instead of deterring her, it steeled her resolve. Damien had taken her dignity, her trust, and years of her life. She would not let him take her silence too. If you'd like, I can move directly into Chapter 7, Blood on My Hands, where Alara and Liam witness Damien commit an act of violence that makes their mission even more urgent. The night was damp and windless, the kind of cold that crept through the seams of your coat. Alara sat in the passenger seat of Liam's old nondescript sedan, its heater humming quietly as they watched the back entrance of a warehouse near the docks. Liam had traced a series of encrypted messages to this location. Damien was meeting an associate here to settle a dispute over a missing shipment. They had been waiting for nearly 2 hours, sipping lukewarm coffee from paper cups, when headlights swept across the wet pavement. A sleek black SUV rolled up, its tinted windows reflecting the flicker of the street lamps. Damien stepped out first, perfectly dressed as always, but with a tightness in his posture that Alara recognized as anger barely contained. A shorter man emerged from the warehouse, his voice raised even before he reached Damien. Through the windshield, Alara couldn't make out every word, but the tone was unmistakable. Accusation, frustration, fear. Damien stood still for a moment, letting the man rant, and then, without warning, grabbed him by the collar. Alara's breath caught as Damien shoved the man hard against the side of the SUV, the sound of the impact echoing in the night. He said something low and sharp, and when the man tried to push him away, Damien struck. One swift, brutal punch to the gut, then another to the jaw. The man crumpled to his knees. Damien kicked him once before a second figure from the warehouse pulled him back. Liam was already snapping photos, his camera's muted shutter clicking in rapid succession. "This is enough to show he's dangerous," he murmured, eyes never leaving the viewfinder. "It's not enough to take him down," Alara replied quietly. Her hands were clenched in her lap, her pulse pounding. She knew Damien had power, connections that could make evidence disappear or twist it into something harmless. A few photos of a fight wouldn't survive his lawyer's spin. The SUV doors slammed. Within seconds, the vehicle pulled away, tires hissing on wet asphalt. The injured man staggered back inside the warehouse, holding his side. Liam lowered the camera, exhaling slowly. Alara stared at the now empty street. "We need something they can't dismiss," she said, her voice firm. "Paper trails, bank transfers, documents with his name on them. Something no one can twist." "That means getting closer to him," Liam warned. "Closer than you have in years." She turned to him then, and for a moment, the distance between them felt fragile, thin. His gaze softened, not the way Damien looked at her with calculation, but with a quiet understanding that saw her not as a pawn, but as someone fighting to reclaim herself. The moment stretched, the hum of the car and the faint smell of rain wrapping around them. "Then we get closer," she said finally. Liam nodded, starting the engine. As they drove off, Alara looked out at the dark water beyond the docks. She knew the risks were growing, that the next step could cost her more than she was ready to lose. But she also knew there was no turning back. Damien had drawn blood, figuratively and literally, and she was prepared to return the blow, no matter what it took. If you'd like, I can now continue with Chapter 8, The Public Unveiling, where Alara sets her trap for Damien in the most humiliating way possible. The night of the auction was the kind of cold that made the Thames shimmer under the city lights. The grand hall of the Harrington auction house glowed with opulence. Crystal chandeliers spilling gold across marble floors, rows of velvet-covered chairs filled with London's elite, foreign collectors, and the press. The air buzzed with polite conversation, the occasional clink of a champagne flute, and the soft rustle of catalog pages. Alara stood near the back, a black evening gown hugging her frame, her hair swept into an elegant chignon. She looked every bit the poised socialite, but beneath the surface, her heart was steady with purpose. Liam sat a few rows ahead, a discreet earpiece linking them. Their weeks of preparation, the careful gathering of files, decrypted bank statements, audio recordings of Damien's illicit deals, had all been leading to this. Damien was front and center, playing the charming host for the evening. The auction featured several rare works donated through his company, a spectacle meant to impress investors and reaffirm his spotless public image. Celine was beside him in a crimson gown, her hand resting lightly on his arm, the picture of sophistication. Alara wondered if Celine had any idea what was about to happen. When the gavel fell on the third lot, a Botticelli sketch, Damien stepped up to the microphone to make a short speech. His voice carried easily over the crowd, warm and confident. Alara signaled the technician, an old contact from the gallery who owed her more than one favor. At first, the projection screen behind Damien displayed the next lot's details. Then, seamlessly, the image flickered. Numbers and names began to appear, transaction records, Damien's signature on falsified provenance documents, photos of stolen paintings hidden in storage facilities. The chatter in the room stopped. The slide changed again, now showing an audio waveform, followed by a recording of Damien's voice. Move the shipment before the inspectors come. Pay them off if you have to. Use the offshore account. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Damien turned, his face blanching as he saw what was on the screen. "Shut that off!" he barked at the technician, but the man kept working the controls, pretending not to hear. Celine's smile faltered, her hand dropping from his arm. "What is this, Damien?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough for those nearby to hear. Alara stepped forward then, her heels clicking against the marble, her eyes locked on Damien. "It's the truth," she said clearly. "Everything you've built is a lie, and now everyone knows it." The press surged forward, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. Investors began to whisper among themselves, some already moving toward the exit. Celine backed away from Damien, her expression shifting from confusion to cold disgust. "You're finished," she hissed before turning and walking out without a glance back. Damien tried to speak over the noise, to reclaim control, but the hall door swung open and two plainclothes officers stepped in. They moved quickly through the crowd, flashing badges before taking hold of his arms. "Damien Holt, you're under arrest for fraud, trafficking of stolen art, and obstruction of justice," one officer announced. The room erupted in a mix of shock and satisfaction. Damien's protests echoed as he was let out, his perfect suit rumpled, his mask of charm shattered. Alara stood still, the flashes of cameras catching her calm, unflinching expression. For the first time in years, she felt no fear in his presence, only the quiet certainty that she had taken back the power he had stolen from her. If you'd like, I can continue with Chapter 9, Scars That Speak, where Alara begins to rebuild her life while processing the damage left behind. The weeks after the auction passed in a strange blur. Headlines about Damien Holt filled the news. His arrest, the collapse of his company, the flood of investors demanding repayment. Reporters camped outside the London penthouse, shouting questions anytime she stepped onto the street. Alara ignored them all. She had no interest in being part of the media frenzy. Instead, she packed her life into 2 suitcases and boarded a ferry to Ireland. The sea air was sharp and clean, carrying none of the suffocating weight of the city. By the time she reached her mother's small cottage on the west coast, the sky was beginning to clear, streaks of pale gold breaking through the clouds. Margot greeted her at the door, frailer than Alara remembered, but with the same warm eyes. They fell into each other's arms, the quiet of the moment saying more than words could. In the days that followed, Alara settled into a slower rhythm, helping with the garden, making tea in the mornings, walking along the cliffs when the weather allowed. But no matter how peaceful the surroundings, the betrayal lingered. There were moments when she would catch herself staring out at the horizon, feeling the phantom sting of Damien's words, the cold humiliation of watching him with Celine. The wound wasn't gone. It had simply stopped bleeding. The scar was there, tender when touched, but it was part of her now. One windy afternoon, Liam arrived. He stood at the gate in a worn jacket, his hair ruffled by the sea breeze. "You didn't answer my calls," he said with a small smile, "so I figured I'd just show up." They walked along the cliff path, the sea roaring below. For a while, they spoke about nothing in particular: her mother's health, the weather, the stubbornness of the gulls that nested nearby. Then Liam stopped, looking at her with a seriousness that made her heart quicken. "You know," he said, "I've met people who crumble when their world falls apart. But you didn't just survive. You fought back. You faced him, and you won. That's strength." He paused, his voice softening. "It's the most beautiful thing about you." Alara's throat tightened. She turned her face toward the sea, letting the wind carry away the heat that rose in her cheeks. "I still bleed inside, Liam," she admitted quietly. "I still wake up some mornings and feel smaller than I used to be. That's not weakness," he said. "That's proof you're human. And the bleeding will stop. You'll see." They walked on, their shoulders brushing occasionally, the silence between them comfortable. For the first time in a long while, Alara felt the possibility of something beyond survival, something like healing. She wasn't whole yet, but she was no longer broken, and that was enough for now. If you want, I can now bring this to its emotional close in Chapter 10, My Victory in Silence, giving Alara a quiet but powerful ending. Months slipped by, marked not by headlines or court dates, but by the quiet rhythm of days in Ireland. Alara spent her mornings painting at a small easel by the cottage window, afternoons sketching along the coast, and evenings cataloging her work. The chaos of London felt like another lifetime, one she no longer had to inhabit. Her project began as a private act of therapy, a series of paintings and sketches exploring the pain, betrayal, and eventual resilience she had lived through. She worked without planning to show them, pouring her memories into every stroke of color and line of charcoal. But when Liam visited again and saw the pieces stacked against the wall, he insisted the world needed to see them. With his encouragement and the quiet blessing of her mother, Alara gathered her work into a single volume. She titled it Blood and Scars. The name felt right. It was unflinching, but not bitter. The book was published through a small art press, and to her surprise, it caught fire. Critics praised its raw honesty, its beauty born from darkness. Soon, it was translated into several languages, displayed in galleries from Dublin to New York. And yet, the success didn't tempt her back into the life she had left behind. She declined interviews, turned down invitations to glamorous events, and ignored the occasional message from old acquaintances in London who suddenly remembered her name. Her silence became her shield, and in that silence, she was untouchable. One crisp autumn morning, she walked alone to the cliffs near her childhood home. The Atlantic stretched endlessly before her, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face. In her hands, she held the first printed copy of Blood and Scars, its cover worn at the edges from being carried with her. She ran her fingers over her name on the spine, not as Damien's wife, not as someone defined by loss, but as herself. She thought of all the versions of herself that had existed: the hopeful young curator, the devoted wife, the woman who had felt invisible. And now, this one, steady, whole, alive. She no longer needed to imagine his downfall or replay the moments of betrayal. Damien's world had already collapsed, and she had no desire to sift through the ruins. Her victory was here, in the salt air, in the knowledge that she had rebuilt her life into something he could neither touch nor tarnish. She closed her eyes, let the wind fill her lungs, and smiled, not for the past, but for everything still ahead. She turned back toward the path home, the book tucked under her arm, her footsteps steady on the rocky ground. The tide crashed far below, but its noise no longer sounded like chaos. It sounded like freedom.